G'day AAMCA. We're here with Mats Ekstrom, Professor of Media and Communication at the University of Oerbro, talking about the application of conversation analysis to the study of journalism. So Mats, what kind of research do you do with journalism?
Yeah, we do research especially on different forms of interviews, interviewing practices in journalism.
What kinds of practices and what kinds of things?
I mean, it's all a variety of different forms of interviewing that journalists use in their everyday practice. I mean, both live studio talk with politicians, more adversarial or critical interviews, but also more reporter interviews done in fieldwork, in preparing news reports, etc. Also interviews in between journalists, etc. So it's mainly in broadcasting, in relation to broadcasting.
Okay, and so why are these sorts of interviews interesting to research?
Sorry?
Why are these sorts of interviews useful and interesting to research?
Yeah, they are interesting because if you're interested in social interaction, conversation, this is a form of institutionalized conversation, which is really important also from a societal perspective, because, for example, politicians, when they appear in public, it's in interviews, mainly in interviews, so it makes sense also from that perspective. But I mean, I'm also interested from a very basic perspective in how social interaction is organized in different forms of institutional context. But I also think that actually, this might be important for the profession, because doing interviews is kind of the main method in doing journalism in different phases of a journalistic work.
So, if you could perhaps describe one of your studies to ground this, what kinds of things have you researched and what have you found?
Yeah, for example, when we have been doing research on political interviews, we have looked into how questions are designed in order to ask politicians as accountable for different political decisions, or what they do or what they haven't done, etc. So we are looking into the design of questions, but also how the politicians deal with questions and the situations created by the questions. And I mean, it's normally that, so to say, from a journalistic point of view, that a good question to a politician should create some kind of communicative conflict, some situation which is hard for the politician to deal with. But of course, they also have their strategies in order to deal with the questions. So that's one thing we have looked into.
Okay, and so how does that kind of research end up useful to journalists themselves?
Yeah, I think journalists can learn more about the variety of different forms of question or questions design that they actually use in practice, but also how different forms of questions work, what job they actually do in the interaction. So that's something that they can learn. I mean, the fact that all journalists that I've been talking to and also interviewed think a lot about what is a good way of doing this specific interview. So if we can have an analytical perspective on them based on conversation analysis, I think they can learn something from their own practices and the variety of different ways to, for example, design questions.
So to unpack that a little bit, what do you mean when designing questions? What kind of differences would you be finding and talking about there?
Yeah, I mean, when we deliver an utterance, or do an action by saying something, we can design that in different ways. And I mean, one practice quite often used in accountability interviews is, for example, to build in different forms of presuppositions in the questions. Having a politician, I mean, the communicative conflict that such questions create is that the politician on the one hand is supposed to actually answer the question, because the audience, we know that, and the politicians know that audiences don't like politicians who do not answer the questions. But on the other hand, if the journalists build in presuppositions into the question that the politician don't want to accept, because it might imply a criticism against something that he has or she has been doing or not doing, it creates a conflict, because answering the question will mean that you also accept this presupposition. So that's an example.
And so, have you been doing sort of work with journalists about this kind of stuff? And if so, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, what we have been doing is, on one hand, following journalists in their everyday work in kind of newsroom studies, and in this context also have had the opportunity to discuss what they are doing from this analytical point of view. But that is, of course, a kind of vague interaction concerning these questions. But we have also arranged seminars with broadcasters and news anchors and journalists in Swedish broadcast, and showed them transcripts, and have had discussions based on transcripts on interviews, and discussed, I mean, what did this question, for example, actually do, when we see how it was responded to and how it kind of influenced the development of the ongoing interaction. And these seminars or discussions has been in relation to really, in the Swedish context and also in other contexts, really, you could say, really important forms of interviews, namely the election campaign interviews, which are broadcasted live. And this is a really, I mean, from the journalistic profession, these interviews are really important, because they know that they will be public viewed by a great number of people, but they will also be referred to in the media. So this is doing these interviews for a journalist is a kind of a really give them high status also. And so in relation to these interviews, the election campaigns interviews that they are doing with the political leaders, we have discussed actually how these interviews have developed, and how different questions works. But this is only, these seminars we have done only on kind of a small scale. So I'm looking forward to do much more into this area. So I see it more as kind of experiments or pilot seminars.
Sounds really great, Mats. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you.